Megamind and Despicable Me have often been compared to each other since they were both animated movies centered around a bad guy becoming a hero, released only 4 months apart. But as I already discussed at length in another video, which you can find a link in the description to, despite both having a rather odd premise for an animated kids movie, they don't actually have that much in common when all's said and done. But rather than go over all of that again, today I'd like to specifically take a look at the true villains of their respective movies, that being Hal Stewart / Titan and Victor Perkins / Vector, and go over how much they actually have in common. Because despite what it may look like at first glance, it isn't all that much. And obviously there will be spoilers for both movies ahead, so in case you somehow haven't seen either of them yet and don't want to know what happens, you shouldn't proceed with this video. Okay, so similar to the conclusion I reached in my video comparing Megamind to Despicable Me, which is that despite appearing similar, they're actually two very different movies, the same can honestly be said for their villains as well. Because to go over the things they have in common first, both appear to be very nerdy and non-threatening at first, are very comical in nature, and are often the victims of extreme slapstick, and are meant to represent fresh blood to older supervillains and how their newer, more efficient approach quickly becomes a major threat to them. But other than that, the two are pretty much complete opposites. Because while Vector is very much the nerd he's initially made out to be, if definitely an evil one, Titan only superficially appears to be a nerd, and in actuality has virtually nothing in common with them, as I went over in another video. And in a similar vein, while both are the victims of slapstick and very funny overall, not only does Hal get it a lot worse in this department, but his humor almost completely dies off once he truly becomes the bad guy. While by contrast, Vector maintains a much more steady sense of humor throughout his entire movie, and isn't put through the ringer quite as much as Hal until the very end. And going along with this, there's also their initial first impression, which not only is the exact opposite of who the characters really turn out to be, but are also completely different from each other too. Because Hal initially looks like a pathetic nerd who might be hiding something good and smart under that exterior, only for him to turn out to be a creep who's unbelievably stupid, and moreover way too willing to give in to the corruption of power. While Vector, by contrast, comes across as an annoying buffoon in his first scene, only for him to turn out to be a much smarter and more competent threat than both Gru and the audience would have ever suspected. To put it simply, Hal looks as if he's smarter than he appears at first, and turns out to be a complete idiot, while Vector looks as if he's an incompetent moron who turns out to be a villain smart enough to more than give Gru a run for his money. But on that topic, another thing that's different about them is how the narrative treats them. Because simply put, Megamind's narrative has no respect for Hal at all, and even at his most dangerous and threatening, he still comes across as a complete loser. As I said in my video where I compare him to Bowser, which you can also find a link in the description to, Titan is never meant to be anything but completely pathetic, with his rampage towards the end really being nothing more than him throwing a huge temper tantrum now that he has the power to do so and get away with it. Because he may have the powers of a god, but that doesn't change the fact that he's still just the same little man-child that he was before. Vector, however, is given a lot more dignity by his narrative, which is why he's subject to less slapstick overall until the end, when he really gets what's coming to him. But the point is, despite being presented as a total nerd, he still puts his smarts to excellent use and proves to be a threat that Gru must take seriously, and as such is also treated that way by the narrative. Basically, one is able to prove themselves a worthy opponent to the main character, and thus earns the narrative's respect to be seen that way, while the other is simply a pathetic loser who's nothing without his powers, and thus is never treated with dignity even when he's a credible threat. And finally, there's how each villain ties into the theme of their respective movies. Now, I've already dedicated countless videos to explaining how Titan fits into the theme of Megamind, especially in my Doom Syndicate video, which you can also find a link in the description to if you're more interested in this particular topic. So to avoid repeating myself, all I'll say is that Hal functions perfectly as a dark reflection of Megamind and shows exactly what he might have become had he been truly evil instead of just pretending to be. He's in pretty much every way possible the complete opposite of him, and shows why the audience should be thankful that Megamind only plays the role of a villain instead of actually being one. But like I said, I already got into this in other videos, so for right now I'll just leave it at that. But with Vector, it's a lot more complicated than that, because Gru's only ambition in life was to become the greatest villain of all time, but was hardly able to amount to anything as a villain. And as Mr. Perkins is all too willing to point out, he's already past his prime and unlikely to accomplish anything of note at his age. And to that end, Vector perfectly represents the threat of younger, more ambitious supervillains who also have the advantage of thinking outside the box in ways he hasn't been able to. In other words, Gru, in many ways, is his own worst enemy, but in addition to having to deal with that, and every villain's problem of evading the authorities, he now also has to deal with younger villains vying for the position that he covets most. And the fact that Vector is able to outsmart him at almost every turn only reinforces that. Basically, Vector represents Gru not only having to come to terms with his age, but also that maybe his chosen profession as a villain isn't what he was meant to be in life. And you notice how when he's trying to break into Vector's lair to get the shrink ray back, he's foiled every time. But at the end, when he's trying to rescue the girls, he effortlessly gets past everything to the point that he's forced to flee? Because the only way Gru could truly defeat him was not by becoming a better villain, but by embracing what he was meant to be, a father and good person. But despite all of these differences between the two characters, one can't deny that something they definitely have in common is that they perfectly do their job of being the villain within their given story. Because simply put, it can be pretty hard to write a villain for a main character who's already a villain, as I've also noted in other videos. But both Titan and Vector pulled that off flawlessly, being very well written as villains and perfectly tying into the themes of their respective movies. So even if they don't share much beyond that, nobody can deny that they do arguably make for better villains than either Gru or Megamind. But as their final fates also show, that is most definitely a good thing. Okay, I think that's everything I had to say on that. So why don't all of you tell me? Do you believe that Titan and Vector don't have all that much in common beyond some superficial similarities? Or do you think they're more alike than I'm giving them credit for? Please let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And as I always say, you do not have to agree with me or any opinions expressed in this video that you don't like. You can feel about both Megamind and Despicable Me however you want to, and nobody can tell you you're wrong. And thank you all for watching. It is all very much appreciated, and I hope to see you all next time.